Steve, thanks for coming back so we left off yesterday, we were talking about the tail end of the miscellaneous ag bill, the stormwater runoff question, right?
Yep.
So, but you crammed a lot into the last few minutes, so the testimony before the end of the hour, but I think it might be helpful to go back and just be sure that we're all clear on what's there now and what was there originally and how it, what the differences are.
Yep. Well, yes, thank you so much for having me back. Steve Collier from the Agency of Agriculture. Before I start, if I can, I just want to apologize for something I said yesterday. It's not a big deal, but it was unprofessional. I regretted it as soon as I said it, and I'd like to take it back. It was somebody asked me about our penalties philosophy and how we do it, and I was talking about it, and I said that people disagree with us. And when I was doing that, I named a specific entity, which I'd rather not name again because I don't want to cause any more, bring more attention to it. But I regretted it when I said it. It wasn't necessary. It was inappropriate. And I try to be better than that. I want better relationships with the entities that criticize us because I do think there's a lot more room for common ground than we sometimes find, especially with environmental groups. So it was beneath me and I apologize for saying it. And if you don't remember it, great. But if you do remember it.
There. And I've done it too. So you're forgiven on my part.
Well, thank you. I just regret it and wish you'd disregard it.
We all say, every day, I'm sure. So we wish afterwards, I wish I had not said that or said it differently. But thank you for,
Absolutely. So thank you for hearing me out on that. So if you don't mind, I'm going to try to go through a lot of what I said yesterday, but slower. Especially, this whole overall construct is quite complicated. The specific issue here we think is not at all complicated, but I'll give you a little background. If at any time you don't want to hear it, just cut me off. But the whole point here, right, is keeping our water clean. And one of the biggest ways that our water gets contaminated is through runoff from pollutants. And there's many different ways that happens. But in 1972 or 73, I think it was 1972, Congress passed the Clean Water Act. And through the Clean Water Act, they regulated point sources. And so point sources are defined in federal law, but they're basically a discrete conveyance. So think pipe. And anything that is a direct, that contains water and brings it directly to surface water. So there's a point source. So there's something that like a pipe, but then there's also the question of, does that water from the point source get to surface water? Because if you have pollutants getting to surface water, that's a direct discharge. You can't do that in this country or in this state without a permit. It's called a NPDES permit, which I think is National Pollutant Elimination System, or National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. So if you're going to have a point source that has pollutants in it and you're going to discharge that to water, you can only do that legally with a permit. And EPA grants those permits, or they can delegate state entities to grant those permits. So those permits in Vermont can be granted by ANR because ANR is the delegated entity from the EPA. The state legislature has also delegated this authority to ANR to administer this NPDES permit process program. And also you've delegated them the authority to manage stormwater. So that's there's point sources, that's who manages point sources. And then there's non-point sources. Non-point sources are basically, they're not defined in federal law. They're basically anything that's not a point source that also can discharge to water. So in Vermont, all farms at the moment, as far as if I'm up to date on that, are not considered point sources. They are considered non-point sources. And so we, the Agency of Agriculture, manages those farms as non-point sources through the required agricultural practices. Now, a farm, a CAFO it's called, which is a concentrated animal feeding operation. And that's really the production area where you have a lot of animals because there can be a lot of there's a lot of manure, potentially waste, a lot of different things in that production area that can have waste. And a CAFO itself, so this is an example of where you don't need a pipe. The CAFO can be a point source that because it can be considered that production area has so much waste in it that it can be, and if it runs off the surface water, that can be a point source. So A&R can require a farm to get a CAFO permit. In that case, that farm would be subject to, would have a NIPD's permit, would be subject to A&R regulation, and would not be one of our non-point source farms. I think Michael O'Grady told you the other day that back in, I think he said 2004, I didn't even know this, but he said that, I think it was Phil Benedict and Mike, I can't think of Mike Dwayne who was an AG and worked for the Agency of Agriculture, sort of developed this non-point source program as a recommendation of EPA back in 2004. So there's these two different things that work. Either you're a point source, you need a permit, or you're a non-point source and you might need these controls. So it's important just to have that framework, because the towns that are managing stormwater are doing it through a NIPD's permit, because stormwater, when it's all collected and has waste in it and goes into the lake or wherever, can require a permit. So it's also important to understand that under federal law, agricultural stormwater does not need a NIPD's permit. So there's both the point source issue, there's the non-point source issue, but also farm agricultural stormwater does not require a permit. A CAFO can require a permit. Stormwater discharge does not require a permit. So now, does that all make reasonable amount of sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Senator O'Brien?
Yeah, just if you can help me get my head around this. So tile drainage, pipe coming out of the field, is that a point source or not?
Some people think so. It's not managed as a point source in Vermont. There are people pressuring to have that done. There's not only is ag stormwater exempt under the federal permitting system, but there's also a phrase that I'm paraphrasing, but it's basically, it says irrigation and return flows are also exempt from agriculture. So there are people who are pushing to think it is. It is not considered one in Vermont. I don't think it is under federal law. Some people think it should be considered as such under state law. Our position is more research needs to be done on tile drain, but also that tile drain is not only a great farming practice, but it actually allows things to infiltrate into the soil rather than running off the surface. So I'm not an expert on the science behind the evaluation, but as I understand it, we don't currently think that there is evidence to suggest that it's better to have things run off the surface rather than infiltrate down through the ground, because that's where a lot of the nutrients and other things can actually be retained in the soil and so come out through the drain. So I think it's safe to say in Vermont right now, tile drain is not regulated as a point source. There are people pushing for that.
Okay, and then what about water in a production area comes off roofs and
Yeah.
it goes into a ditch? Is that a point source?
So if you don't mind, I'm going to explain the sort of current overlay for farms now, because that answers that question. Because I think it's a critically important question, because what I've heard the town say to date is we have to manage the stormwater. Everybody has to contribute. It's only fair if you're all paying for this. And so you need to pay for what's on your property. There's some appeal to that argument, right, on a superficial level. But taking a step back, farms, in our opinion, are doing more than anyone to manage their stormwater. And here's why. Because in the required agricultural practices, you are required as a farm to collect all of your stormwater that's in the production area. You cannot let water, so when it rains, snow melt, whatever it is, you can't just let the water in your production area run off, because it's presumed to be contaminated with waste, whether it is or not, and nobody's out there testing it, but it's presumed to be, because there is significant amount, there's food, there's fertilizers, a significant amount of things. So in anything where there's production area, farms can't let it run off. And that's the key, I think, to all this when you're looking at fairness, is farms have to, other entities, and I don't know a lot about how other entities do it, but they don't have to maintain it and keep it and spread it. Other entities that have, like in developed entities that have stormwater, they might have to have a catch basin, but it can overflow. They don't have to manage it completely. Farms can't do it. They have to collect it all. They have to store it. And that's a huge expense because when you're storing it, you can't spread for about 4 months in Vermont every winter. So when you're collecting not only your waste, but you're also collecting all of your water, you need a lot of space. And those pits to keep all of that are really expensive. The collection systems to keep it all are very expensive. So I've heard some people on the Senate side were kind of talking about, well, you shouldn't have to pay the fee to St. Albans town or whatever town because you already paying a $2,500 LFO permit. And that's true. You have to pay every year. An LFO has to pay us $2,500 for the permit. MFO has to pay $1,500 for the permit. That to me is a misnomer. I mean, yes, they do have to pay the permit fee, but that's not where the real expense is. And the permit fee is to basically give us some money to go out and inspect these farms because there's a lot of costs in doing that and enforcing the rules. And yes, it's true, they are paying us a permit fee, but they're paying hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars to collect and manage all of their waste. And they get some federal and state help with that, but it's still very expensive. So when you're talking about everybody contributing, in our opinion, that's the whole point, is farms are contributing a lot. And to make them pay not only to collect and manage all their stormwater, but also pay a separate fee to the town when they can't discharge their stormwater to that town, that doesn't make any sense. So basically, you're making farms pay twice when they can only use the one system, which is they have to manage their own stormwater. Now, I think another important part of that is this is about production area. Of course, farms can have water run off their fields. But all of their fields are subject to a lot of practices which are also regulated by us. The whole point of both the production area and the field management practices is farms, if they follow all the required agricultural practices, the legal presumption is they are not discharging waste to water at all. That's what the whole construct, that's what the whole setup is. If you do all this right, you might be discharging water, but it's not waste because the waste is being infiltrated into the soil. You've got the vegetated buffer between the farm field and the river or the lake. You've got appropriate setbacks. And I think really importantly, really importantly, there's something called the nutrient management plan. So farms have to not only have the practices, but they're required to limit the amount of nutrients that they're applying in a certain field so that it doesn't become oversaturated, so that it can still hold the waste, and so that there's not phosphorus or other runoff coming from these fields. So the whole idea is farms, you have to manage your stormwater and your water and your waste so that you're not discharging. So the idea that you have to then pay the town to manage the water that you're not discharging doesn't really seem from our perspective, a very good argument.
So I just want to insert parenthetically, and then I think John's ahead of you, but I think we're hearing policy argument for why it wouldn't necessarily be a good idea to have municipal permit fees or fees of some sort. That policy argument, though, is different from the legal argument that you're making, I think.
Correct.
Yep.
I think they're complementary, but absolutely you're right. They're different. Yep.
And then I wanted to ask, just again, before we go back to Representative O'Brien, can you remind us, so CAFOs, am I pronouncing that correctly?
CAFO, that's how I say it.
Yep. Concentrated animal feeding operations.
Yep.
In Vermont, does that equate to LFOs? And what's the definition? How does that overlay?
So, no, great question. All of the definitions come from federal law.
Yep.
So in state statute in chapter 215 of Title VI, which is where the water quality regs are, there's something called an animal feeding operation, and then there's medium farm operation, large farm operation. Those definitions are mimic federal law. But the distinction I would say is that it's a large farm operation that we manage because it's subject to our jurisdiction, our rules. We're not considering that a CAFO that requires a NPDES permit. A&R, if they thought that this CAFO that we manage was discharging to water, they could say, you need a NIPD's permit. And then it would be a farm that A&R would manage and we would not, at least for the water quality pieces of it. So they're the same definitions, but when we say LFO, MFO, we're not talking about a CAFO that is being regulated by EPA or by A&R.
And then the earlier you were saying that there are no federal regulations on stormwater runoff for farms.
What I hoped I said was that the federal regulations do not, for agricultural stormwater is exempt under federal law from needing a NIPD's permit.
Okay, you did say that, right? I
Yeah. Yeah.
your words a little bit differently. Okay.
It's meaning only that the stormwater itself under federal law is not subject to NIPD's permitting, which is just another, the state law here is, I think, is key for you all to consider. But the federal overlay is helpful in thinking about whatever arguments may be made on the other side of why this is appropriate. Because we think state law is very clear, but in addition to that, under the federal NIPD's permitting program, which encompasses these MS4 permits, agricultural stormwater is exempt from the NIPD's permitting process. So it's just something to keep in mind. So even if you're saying, well, we interpret state law this way, so we should be regulating ag stormwater through our NIPD's permit, the next question I think then becomes, well, wait a second, the NIPD's permit has an exemption for agricultural stormwater. So does that make sense? Is that, okay.
Representative O'Brien?
So 2 quick questions. Can you just define stormwater and then, because we talked about it, but just to get an idea or really I guess you can do that.
Sure, I can't give you the precise legal definition off the top of my head, but it's defined in, it's in Title 10 and Title 10, Section 1264 is where the legislature delegated the authority to manage stormwater to A&R. And it's in that section that stormwater is controlled, but it's essentially all water that comes from a natural event, so rain or snow melt, and it's flowing over surfaces and gathering waste. So it's not, human generated water sources. It's naturally occurring, but it still moves across surfaces. And the way they really evaluate it, and this is important too when you're thinking about production areas, because what towns are doing is they're looking at farms' production areas and they're creating fees based on their production areas, because there's no perfect way you can't stop water, but you can manage it, but you can't stop it. And so one of the ways that fees are generated, either by A&R through their permitting program or by towns through their permitting program, is looking at impervious surfaces. The idea being, so an impervious surface is anything where water can't penetrate, infiltrate naturally into the ground. So it can be a road, parking lot, a roof, anything where when the water hits it, it's not infiltrating, it's instead running. And so that's how the fees, it's not an exact measure, I don't think, but it's how the fees are generated, which is really important when you're thinking what towns are doing to these farms is they're saying you have some of them, I think some of them do it differently, but a lot of them are looking at your overall impervious surfaces that the farm has, and they're assessing a fee based on that. And the fees can be thousands of dollars. And to us, that's where that double fee comes in. I mean, look, the farms, they can't let this stormwater run off. They have to collect it, store it, land apply it. So you're charging them for their impervious surfaces, because I've heard some people say, well, farms still have water run off their fields. Yeah, they do. It's not supposed to have any waste in it because of the practices, but it's not the water off the fields. The towns aren't charging people for their field management. They're charging people for their impervious surfaces. And this is a key point. We are not for 1 second saying, when they talk about everybody has to pay their share, we are not saying that farms shouldn't have to pay for their residents. So every farmer that lives on the farm has a residence there too. There is these municipalities, these municipal entities are charging residential stormwater fees. We're not saying farmers shouldn't pay those. If they have a residence there, they absolutely should pay those. That's not farming. If they have a business on their farm that's not farming and they have impervious surfaces, they can pay those fees. All we're saying is that to the extent that you are farming and you are subject to the required agricultural practices, you are required to manage your wastewater. Towns, you don't have any legal authority over that not wastewater, stormwater. Towns, you don't have any legal authority over that stormwater, so you can't also regulate it. And I do want to get into that state law because I do think it's the most important thing. But did I answer your question, Representative O'Brien?
Yeah, so the follow-up was, for context, and maybe we need to think outside of municipalities, so I'm thinking like the campus at Global Foundries or UVM Health Center or maybe Camp Johnson, a place where there's not a city involved. Do they all have to get these NIPT permits?
So they can either be permitted through A&R, and so they do need to manage their stormwater. A&R has different thresholds that it implements depending, I think, upon the amount of impervious surface you have. So as one example, they call it the 3-acre permit. So if you have 3 acres of impervious surface, you have to do certain things. I don't know all of their thresholds of how they manage, who does what, because we're focused on the agricultural side, but definitely if you meet certain thresholds, then you're an industrial, then yes, then A&R would get you a permit, or the municipality, if they've assumed that legal responsibility, the municipality would charge you the fee. And you'd be operating through the municipality's permit, as I understand it then. So.
Same kind of definition question, probably much shorter since you already explained this, but impermeable surfaces are the same as production areas on farms?
So impervious surface has its own definition.
Okay.
And it
What's
means
a production?
the reason that they're related to the production area is because a farm production area is where there are a lot of impervious surfaces, because a building, a barn, its roof is impervious surface. The production area where all the animals are operating, that's probably so compacted that the land, it's not really infiltrating into that land. So anything where the water can't naturally infiltrate into the land.
It's production area.
It's production area, but it may also be an impervious surface. And the reason I link them is because most impervious surfaces on a farm are going to be in the production area. Okay. But you could also have a farm road and depending on, some farm roads might not be impervious, but if you have a gravel farm road, then that is likely to be impervious. So
because I'm seeing like a little gray zone here, right? So a driveway isn't a production area. It's soft water. If there's a house that the driveway leads to, for example, then is that captured, not water captured? Is that within the jurisdiction of the municipality to charge a fee against?
So that I would bring you back to this discussion about it. We are only saying that in our belief that farms are exempt from this municipal requirement.
Not the driveway.
If it's a residential driveway,
Yeah.
if it's a home, if there's a separate business on the farm that's not farming and it has impervious surface, I think those are all fair
They're gonna
game.
get dinged for those things. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just that because agricultural stormwater has to be managed through the required agricultural practices, we believe towns lack any legal authority over that because it's already separately regulated. And I will get into those statutory bases because that's what's the cleanest to us. This whole framework is complicated, confusing, between the federal and the state and EPA and A&R and us. The framework is confusing. The discrete legal issue here is actually, in our opinion, pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
So just to follow up a little bit on that question and that example, a farm with a farmhouse and driveway that leads to the farmhouse, the driveway would not be, I think this is a question you were asking, it's not part of the farm.
Right.
So the municipality could reasonably say, yeah, we're going to require a permit for that.
I think if the driveway is clearly not part of the farm, then there wouldn't be any ambiguity about that. Also, as I understand it, the towns are not measuring impervious surfaces for residential properties. I think instead they are creating a standard rate for every resident. So maybe some towns might be doing this, but what I've heard is the towns are looking. So if they're just talking about a residence, they're giving a straight flat rate and they're not going out and measuring the driveway. I think if there's developed land also, so some sort of business, then they are looking at the impervious surfaces. And what I've heard is for farms, they're charging based on impervious surface. So I don't think towns are really measuring residential driveways. I think they're just saying resident, okay, here's your rate. I may be wrong about that. Again, if they were measuring impervious surfaces for the residents and it wasn't farming, yeah, we think that's fair game. If a road was both a farm road and a driveway, then you start to get a little bit gray, but that's not the key issue here is whether or not one driveway that's multi-purpose could be subject to a fee. It's the farm.
All right.
So, yeah, so can I talk a little bit about the state law? Does that make sense to everyone and just why we think it's so clear? So getting back to the A&R being it is the delegated entity to address stormwater in the state of both NIPD's permits and stormwater in the state of Vermont. And that's very clear by statute. It's in that section 1260-10 VSA 1264. A&R is the delegated entity to manage stormwater. In 1264 D1, it is very clear that farms, and I can read you the language if you want, but farms that are subject to the required agricultural practices are exempt from A&R's jurisdiction. So nobody disagrees about that. You were asking me, I think, before we started about A&R's position a little bit. A&R completely agrees that it does not have any authority over agricultural stormwater that's subject to the RAPs. So that's one key thing, thinking about, so A&R is the delegated entity. Now, towns, and we talked briefly about this yesterday, but municipalities are creatures of legislative enactment. So they don't exist on they don't have this sort of separate constitutional authority like the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They are creations of the legislature. So they're municipal corporations, only have the power that you give them. So they have, the power given to them, and what you gave them, and you did give them, you absolutely gave them the discretionary power to create a stormwater utility that manages stormwater. They can choose to take that responsibility and manage it all in lieu of A&R. But what your law says, and this is in Title 24, which is the municipal statute, and I'll read it because this is 24 VSA 4419. And it's entitled, and this is in the bylaw section where the town where their bylaw authority is, but it says stormwater management and control. Any municipality may adopt bylaws to implement stormwater management and control consistent, this is the key word, consistent with the program developed by the Secretary of Natural Resources pursuant to that other section I mentioned, 1264. So towns have the authority to manage it just like A&R. And that is the key distinction here, is the towns are not managing it like A&R because A&R doesn't have authority over agricultural stormwater. Towns are now, some of them are now claiming they do. I don't understand that argument because what they're saying is somehow they have more authority than the state delegated entity to manage stormwater. Logically, that doesn't make sense. Legally, it makes less than sense because it's clear right there that they can only do it consistently with A&R. Well, it's not consistent when you are regulating something that's exempt from A&R's authority. So that's the first sort of key to me. That's the most important statutory condition. Because I'm not sure that Mr. O'Grady agrees with me on that, if he thinks it's that one or the next one. But to me, this is when you actually talk about what's been delegated to these towns, that's what it is. Keeping in mind, they can't take more than you give them. And what they're been told is you can take this, but only in the same way that A&R does. And they're taking it more than A&R. So the next piece is there's another statutory provision, and it's also in the bylaw section. And what it says is that municipalities cannot regulate practices, can't regulate agricultural practices subject to the required agricultural practices. I'll read that to you too. It's pretty short. This is 24 VSA 4413 D1, so it's in that same bylaw chapter. And it says, I'll quote, "A bylaw under this chapter shall not regulate required agricultural practices, including the construction of farm structures, as those practices are defined by the Secretary of Agricultural, Food and Markets." So it's very clear to us, and I think to everyone, that we regulate stormwater under the required agricultural practices. And what this provision says is that municipalities cannot also regulate things that are subject to the required agricultural practices. So to us, there's these very two clear provisions. One gives the municipality their authority that they do have over stormwater. No one's saying they don't have authority over stormwater, but what we are saying is it has to be consistent with A&R. A&R doesn't have authority over ag stormwater, so neither do you, is our point. And then secondarily, but importantly, there's this other provision that says, moreover, none of your bylaws that you have, and these are zoning bylaws that we're talking about when we're talking about these stormwater utilities, none of your bylaws can regulate required agricultural practices. And the point there, as I understand it, I wasn't around when that was done, was so you don't have conflicting requirements for farms that they have to follow all these required agricultural practices, but then maybe a town, maybe a farm's in 3 towns, and 3 towns are saying you've got to do all these other things too. And the legislature said, no, if these practices are subject to the required agricultural practices, the Agency of Agriculture is regulating them, and towns, you can't also separately regulate them. So to us, those are two just very clear provisions, which kind of gets us back to the point of we don't honestly think this amendment that we've requested is necessary. It's just that we've been having farmers come to us and complain for a number of years now. We've called towns, we've said, hey, we don't think you can do this. And I haven't personally been involved in those conversations, but we've been heard back that they think they can. And so the reason that we could have encouraged farmers to sue their towns, I personally don't think litigation is very often the best way to resolve something. So sometimes it's the only way to resolve something. But what we thought a better solution might be is like, let's just make it crystal clear. So all we asked to do was in this section in 4419 where it says consistent with the program, when it says that municipalities have to manage their stormwater consistent with A&R, we asked to including honoring the exemptions, which are in that program, which is really, in my mind, is surplusage that's not necessary. But we thought, hey, let's make it crystal clear so that the municipalities understand that, hey, you have to follow the same exemptions that A&R has to follow if you choose to take this on. So that was our proposal. And instead of having a bunch of lawsuits, which are, frankly expensive for farms, you probably have to get a bunch of farmers to do it together. The only people who are likely to win over that in the short term are the attorneys, because, you pay, so you get $9,000 back for your last 3 years, and you pay the attorney $25,000 or whatever it would be. It's not a great solution, not great for towns either, to have to get sued and have to defend this and maybe have to refund $80,000 in a given year. So we just asked for the clarification. The Senate Agriculture Committee, when talking about this, heard from some towns, and I don't remember exactly how it came up, but they suggested this indemnity provision that they put in, which would basically said, we're gonna make this change, but we're also going to say for those towns who have been collecting this fee, you don't have to pay for the fees that you've already collected. I don't even know if that's, Mr. O'Grady would be the better person to ask about this. I don't know if that's effective necessarily, because it's hard to change laws retroactively. I'm not saying you can't, but generally speaking, you can always change things prospectively, provided they're constitutional. It's not so easy to go back in time and say, hey, that law that did exist no longer does. So people could potentially challenge that, but we're comfortable with it. We think it's a good compromise. We're not asking that municipalities, we're assuming they're operating in good faith. We're not asking that they refund money, but we do want it to be clear that farms don't have to pay twice, and they don't have to pay a town when they can't even utilize their stormwater system. So we're comfortable with that compromise. And as I think I was saying a little bit yesterday, quickly is all we understand the study was put in place. There's a stay in the current study in the current legislation. There's a stay, so towns couldn't collect for this next year, and that's helpful. Some farmers owe right now, so that's not, perfect. And also then you get to the point where what do you do next year with the fees that weren't collected? So we appreciate the stay. If you're going to go forward with the study, I think the stay is a good idea because it stops people from paying for it now. But the real question, studies take time and effort and money. They just do. And they're wonderful things when there's controversy. Here, there is clearly political controversy. But if you're going to have a study about a legal issue, our opinion, there ought to be legal controversy to warrant it. So I would just encourage you to ask the towns to explain where they think they get their legal authority to regulate agricultural stormwater. And if they come in with a great argument, you talk to Mr. O'Grady about it, talk to other interested parties, maybe say, you know what, they have a good point here. But if they just come in and say everybody should pay their fair share, and that's, in our opinion, that's not a legal argument. So if they come in and tell you why they think under their NIPD's permit where agricultural stormwater is exempt, and if they say these two statutory requirements somehow don't apply, think about it, and maybe a study is the answer.
So Representative O'Brien, and then I wanted maybe just to have you give us quickly a run through of the new language, the study language here. That's on page 9 of what you handed us out yesterday.
Sure.
Just so we can see what currently, if we didn't make any changes, what it is this study would be expected to produce. But before we do that, Rep. O'Brien, did you have a question?
Yeah, just about, if I'm thinking of defending the towns, just to be devil's advocate.
Yeah.
So is there at any point where the EPA can sort of pull rank on the Agency of Agriculture and say, we're handing out these MS4 permits through A&R, but we don't necessarily recognize state law saying that farms are exempt from water quality?
If the EPA thought that they had authority, they could absolutely say that. And the federal government has supremacy. It can enforce federal law. But that would mean they're saying that they have authority over agricultural stormwater, which they don't through the NIPD's permit. So I'd be curious about how they're making that argument. Certainly, the EPA could decide that any individual farm is a CAFO that needs a CAFO permit. But even on a NIPD's permit, but even with a CAFO, ag stormwater, as I understand it, is still exempt, not from the production area, but from the field management. So yes, EPA could come in and say we have jurisdiction, but I don't know how they could come in and say we have jurisdiction over stormwater from a farm, unless they were also saying you're a CAFO that needs a NIPD's permit. If they make that argument, and they did write this, a permit writer from A&R wrote to DEC. It wasn't EPA as per se. It was a permit writer who was contacted by the towns. And so he said, what about this law? A&R is supposed to be talking to the EPA about that. I haven't talked to A&R recently about where they are, but yeah, absolutely. If EPA comes in and says, we have authority over this, I would hear them out. And if they did, maybe yes, their law is different than state law, but I'm not following that logic, given that under the NIPD's permitting program, they don't regulate agricultural stormwater. That's why A&R doesn't, because this is the whole federal overlay. So.
I thought you were asking, John, about the extreme situation, maybe where instead of delegating its authority to the state, EPA said, we're not going to do that. We're going to be the regulating authority here, right? Because at the very beginning of this conversation is right the fact that EPA agreed to let Vermont enforce its regulations rather than doing it itself, and that's not true in every state.
So EPA delegated to ANR its authority to enforce the Clean Water Act. I'm not the expert here, but as I understand this, that does not stop the EPA from separately enforcing if it chose to. So the way I believe it's structured is that they're essentially partners. EPA has given its authority to ANR, but I don't think the EPA also said we can't act independently if we want to.
Case by
Like
case.
CMBLs.
Yeah, right. They also have an interest, but I don't think they do that, or maybe rarely they do, but I think they expect for ANR to do it. But I believe if they thought, certainly, I mean, they have the authority, and you'll hear this word come out and it scares everyone. You know, they have the authority to tell ANR, and it's called dedelegation. If they thought that ANR wasn't doing their job correctly, the EPA could say, we're going to take away our delegation and we're going to do it. It's my understanding that's never happened in any state. I think the EPA wants help, understandably, because every entity has its own resources, and I think the EPA thinks it has plenty to do, and I don't think it wants to take over. I mean, if it thought ANR was doing a horrible job, then yeah, it would probably do that. But I don't have any reason for them to believe that they think ANR is doing a horrible job. But sometimes, and currently there is a dedelegation petition pending because of several environmental groups filed it with EPA. So that's all true. That to me is irrelevant until you hear any legal argument that suggests that municipalities have this legal authority over ag stormwater. So EPA is never going to de-delegate the state of Vermont because we're following state and federal law.
So in the 5 minutes or so that we've got left.
Yep.
Here we are again. Just looking at the very end of the bill as it's currently drafted and the study committee, the recommendations that it's charging the study committee with are policy recommendations. So going back to the distinction I was making earlier between the legal argument that you're making and that we've heard from our own legislative counsel, as opposed to why it might make sense from a fairness standpoint or some other standpoint to, in fact, change statute. If we believe that statute currently is clear, you might still have a reason to think it's clear, but it's not what we want the policy to be. So we're going to change statute to do that. It looks like what's happening in this study group is recommendation on policy changes. Is that?
That's in italics?
Yes.
Okay.
Italicized language.
So that's a fair question. We didn't have a role in drafting this language, and I think it came about very quickly because the Senate Agriculture Committee passed the language, the clarifying language that we had recommended, and then it was kind of passed over to Senate Natural Resources briefly. I don't think Senate Natural Resources took jurisdiction, but they talked about it, and they then recommended to Senate Finance, who took it, I think because of the fee issue, though I don't know that it really should have gone there, but Senate Finance did take it, which I'm not saying they shouldn't have. I don't know that it actually had a focus on, I don't know how that happened, but it went to Senate Finance on crossover, on Friday crossover, and the chair of Senate Natural Resources is actually on Senate Finance as well. So he kind of brought forward the Senate Natural Resources recommendation that it be put to a study committee. Senate Finance talked about it, heard from some farmers, heard from somebody who was representing, I think, St. Albans or maybe more towns. And then the way I heard what they said was Mr. O'Grady testified, and the sort of the feeling I got from that committee was they thought, this seems pretty clear that the law doesn't allow it, so let's put the stay in. So farms aren't getting charged now, but let's say, go ahead and figure this out. So I never heard anyone say we're gonna think about whether the law should be changed to allow municipalities to do this, but you're right. I mean, that could be the argument, and that could be what towns ask for, is to basically change the existing law. That would be interesting because, again, they're running federal NIPDES permits, and federal NIPD's permits don't have authority over agricultural stormwater. So we'd be basically changing state law to give them more authority than the federal law does. I agree with you. That's a potentially a legitimate question. What I think at least Senate Finance was thinking about, from based on just hearing the committee, was let's find out what the law says and whether we should change it to make it clear.
I think we'll ask maybe Mike O'Grady to come back in since he
Yeah.
was involved with drafting the language. But just reading through it quickly, it seems like maybe it's more than that.
So they did take testimony from the towns. Moortown,
Some, the League of Cities and Towns, and I believe some municipal representatives came into Senate Ag early on when the testimony was, and some of them may have come back. I remember early on. Then on Friday crossover, or whatever day that was, somebody, and I don't know if he was a lobbyist or a lawyer or a representative, I missed the name. I wasn't in the committee room, but somebody came and was arguing that the town should be allowed to charge these fees. And I understood that he might have represented St. Albans Town.
Yeah.
Okay, because they have a lot of farms and they get something like $80,000 in fees, I think. And so at least that person came into Senate Finance. I don't know whether other municipal representatives have come in as well. Just an interesting sidelight, Burlington actually in their ordinance has an exemption for ag stormwater. So we thought they were sort of the outlier, saying that that we thought they actually recognized the exemption. And so we contacted them to see why they did. And even though it appears to us to be in their ordinance, they don't actually recognize the exemption, and they're charging Intervale Farms. Yeah.
wow,
So that was
double whammy there.
that was a surprise to us because we thought in their ordinance they had the exemption, and we called them and said, no, we do charge these farms, and please don't say that we don't. And
So
so
Burlington is one of them.
it is one of the towns that has, I don't think they have a lot of farms, but they have some in the Intervale, and they are charging a fee. Yeah.
Just a process question.
Yeah.
Would that end up, the italics part, as like session law? Does it end up in the green books if it passes amended?
So it would not, and it would be session law as I understand it. I don't think that there's no, I can't think of a reason to put this in statute. So I think it would just be session law that would.
Something like policy, we don't usually deal with policy, it's hard statute.
Well, yeah. Good. Anything else that you wanted to add here, Steve, before we?
I don't think so. Does it make sense what I mean, obviously people can have other points they disagree, but does it make sense to you all what we're saying is we just think the towns lack the authority because of these two pretty explicit statutory provisions?
Makes sense.
Yeah. And then that other piece where even if it was a federal requirement, it's still under the federal NIPD's system, ag stormwater is still not subject to a NIPD's permit. So, yeah. And then the equity, and forget about the legal lane, but in the equity lane, farms pay way more than, as far as we know, anyone to manage their own stormwater. So since they have such onerous requirements to manage their stormwater, they shouldn't have to do that and also pay separately for other people in town, a homeowners association or whomever who needs to pay for whatever mechanisms they have to collect their stormwater. Like farms shouldn't have to contribute to that as well when they have to manage their own, except for like I said, the residential, other things, absolutely. But the farm itself, it has to follow our rules. And if it's doing that, it shouldn't have to also pay more.
So why wasn't this flagged? You talked about the why in this whole bill, right off. Or, because other states are dealing with MS4s too, and probably farms in their municipalities. It just seems funny they got this far.
Well, we mean flagged by it.
Flagged in that it already was sort of extra legal and that the municipalities were really running with something they shouldn't have.
Well, I think that, from my perspective, the Senate Agriculture Committee, they heard from people and got their perspectives, but I believe they passed it 5-0, the House keep the S-115. I think they heard people out and thought, it was clear to them, and then sort of late in the game, it got referred.
But I think what he's asking is like, whenever municipalities started
Right,
charging,
exactly.
why wasn't it just immediately like, whoa, you can't do that?
That's a great question. I know at least one of our folks at our agency was calling towns and trying to persuade them, but it wasn't working. And, from our perspective, law is clear. So it's a little bit, I don't love coming to the legislature and asking you to restate the law when it's already clear, but towns weren't listening. And so then you get into the point where you're either suing, which we can't do, obviously, but farms could do that, or we could ask for the help. So we thought, hey, if we can do this without litigation, let's see if we can. But like I said, I didn't expect a lot of pushback.
We've got another witness waiting here. So
Oh, sorry.
Last question.
I was just gonna, I'm just curious if any farms came close to suing or entertaining. It just seems like it's surprising that none of them did.
I don't know the answer to that. I'm certain that some have considered it, but I don't know. I don't know. And you'd probably, to make it economically feasible, because even if you get your money back, you still have to pay for the attorney. You probably would need a group.
Seems like a good, class action.
You'd probably need a group of farmers to do it in order to make it economically feasible in the short term. Yeah.
Great. It has been very helpful.
Well,
Thank you, that was great.
well, thank you. And thank you so much for having us back to talk about it. It is a complicated issue, but not when you get down to it.